to have an open conversation about a very difficult topic. The topic of ConCon, Constitutional Convention, which is every 20 years. New York State has the opportunity to have its citizens vote and have delegates go to a Constitutional Convention. And it's a 3-year process. So the yes/no vote is on our November 7th ballot coming up on November 7th, as I said, on Tuesday. And you just vote yes or no. And if it's yes, then they'll go ahead and elect delegates, and then it takes another year after that to actually organize a Constitution Convention. So we have 2 very distinguished professional speakers, and we are going to talk about the risks and the merits of it. And it's a complicated topic. And then we've divided our time, which is 2 hours, into sort of 3 sections. I've asked both Jerry and Zach to just do a very quick sort of 15-minute introduction. This is not the whole story, it's just an introduction. Then give them a chance to respond to each other, right? So that will be our second part. And I ask a few questions and then there's Q&A from all of you. I flipped a coin, and Gerald Benjamin is going to speak first, and he is going to speak about the merits of ConCon. Professor Benjamin is the director of the Benjamin Center. He's a distinguished professor of political science at SUNY Pulse. And Zach Smith will be speaking second. He is a candidate in District 46, is that right?
Yes.
State Senate, is that right? Okay, and Zach has an MBA as a geologist, and he's an executive officer of NYS, New York Progressive Action Network. Okay, so we're going to give Jared the floor now. Okay.
Okay, you're going to tip me off on like
I'm going
2
to
minutes
give
before.
you like a 5 minutes or a little bit more.
Good afternoon. Nice to see a lot of you again, and some of you for the first time. I'm going to do 2 things in this brief talk. I'm going to talk to you about the change process of the New York Constitution, and I'm going to talk to you about why I think we have to have, it's a good idea to have a Constitutional Convention. How many people have read the New York Constitution?
It's too long to read.
Well, that's a fundamental. So we're talking about something you haven't had a chance to look to study. This is the New York Constitution. It's about the size of a small paperback book.
This is what it's like if you print it from the website.
It's not the same size as the U.S. Constitution, and that's the first thing to remember. We're not asking you to change the U.S. Constitution. In fact, I don't think that would be a very good idea at all. So the New York Constitution, so a document of about 50,000 words. It has lots of details in it that some of us would call not constitutional at all. And then lots of those details are very important for lots of people in New York. So when we come to change the New York Constitution, we have to consider everything that's in it, and we have to think about whether it's a good idea to consider a process that has a chance to change all these things. The question that you'll find on the ballot is in front of you: shall there be a convention to revise the Constitution of the United States? So what this is a return to the people who are in charge to ask them if they're satisfied with their government. This is a referendum on the government. It's a referendum that's cast in 19th century terms, so it's not like the Siena poll that asks you, are you happy with the performance of the governor? Are you happy with the performance of the legislature? Or do you think New York is going in the right direction? It's a referendum process returning to the people who are sovereign in a democratic republic to ask them if their institutional arrangements are still desirable to them. And it was put in the Constitution in 1846. At the Third Constitutional Convention, we've had 9 such meetings, so it's not an unusual or extraordinary thing to do this. In the states, there have been over 200 conventions in the various states. And we are, in the Third Convention, we put this question in to make sure we could go back to the people, because in the 19th century, without going into great detail, they had excessive debt, they had a good deal of corruption, they had irresponsible influence, extraordinary influence by party pressure groups. In other words, they had what we had today. We're in a constitutional system. Not many people understand this. So in a federal system like ours, we have a set of constitutions, and they're complementary to each other. Most people pay attention to the national constitution, and especially to the Bill of Rights. We have the Bill of Rights in the New York Constitution as well, of course. And it's interesting why we have one in both places. I won't be going into that unless you ask me about it. These documents cover some of the same things and some different things. I identified 9 functions of the Constitution of New York. Different scholars have different lists. We tell the government why we're creating it. We structure the government, creating the legislature, the executive and judicial branches. Interestingly, you could imagine, sometimes a mind experiment is interesting. Imagine there not being a government and having to create one. Just like if you create an organization, you have to have rules for the organization or bylaws. So we're going back to kind of, in a way, we're asking, do you want to go back to before you had a government and consider, but we do have something in place, so consider what we have in place and change it. We staff the institutions, that's the electoral process. We talk about who can participate and who runs that. We empower the institutions, we say what they can do and what they can't do. With the state government, we say the state government has plenary power under legal theory, so we tell it what it can't do. That's what the most important function of the Constitution is, unlike the national Constitution where we tell it what it can do. We specify our processes, how the institutions interact with each other. By the way, we also create the capacity to establish a local government system, which is very important. We mandate things upon the government, like we say, you better look after the poor people in New York. We can't have a government that doesn't look after the poor. We say you better keep our wilderness wild. So there are directives. You better provide education. Those are directives to the government that the Constitution makes. We limit the government in certain ways, and that's the Bill of Rights Convention. We talk about relationships with other governments, especially localities. And we have a change process, which we're talking about today. So the difficulty with this process that we're facing, and the criticism you'll hear, have to do with with number 7 and number 9, the change process, and the directives to the government, specifying, empowering the institutions and specifying things the government has to do. And the reasons that people favor this have to do with the structure of the government and the processes of the government and the processes for participation. So the issues of advocates like me are that they're worried about the fundamental structural operations of the government. And the people who are critical of this process don't want to put at risk some of the directives that government has been given because they think they might be damaged in such a process. Because the question we have put before us is an unlimited question. We can't say, just look at the legislature's problems. Just look at the fact that we've had 33 members removed or forced from office for ethical or legal violations, including the leaders of the state legislature. Or we don't have a process that says, just look at the participation of New York, how abysmal it is, and what can be done constitutionally to make participation better. Or just look at the judicial process of New York and how confusing it is and how it doesn't produce justice to ordinary citizens, especially in civil matters, and costs them too much to seek justice. Or just look at the relationships and powers of the local government, which have been disempowered, as you know if you paid any attention to the press. We don't have a process like that. We have one big question. So we're not like California, where people can have an initiative process to change one aspect of the Constitution. We're not like Florida, where a commission directly asks the people every 10 years about specific questions. We have this broad question. We're among the 14 states that have a question. Now, constitutions are changed formally and informally. They're changed by judicial decisions. The reason we have a governor that's far too powerful is because of decisions of our Court of Appeals. The reason we have a lieutenant governor that can be appointed rather than elected is because of the decision of our Court of Appeals. Under the exigencies of politics, I think our Court of Appeals has made some bad decisions for New Yorkers. Constitutions generally are changed in two ways. One through the one way that always bypasses the people in power, and the reason for that should be obvious. If they're benefited by pathological dimensions of the Constitution or problematic dimensions, they won't change those dimensions because they're benefited. So the people have a chance to take back their government and ask them and redefine the government to overcome the problems created by the people in government. For example, excessive incumbent advantages and abuses by incumbents in power. The U.S. Constitution has a path around the Congress. The state constitution has the path we're talking about. Now, this is what the drafters said in 1848. Without the intervention of any other body, that is, the legislature, if the people are dissatisfied with the Constitution, the people could say so and act accordingly. And if not, the existing Constitution would be continued. So you have a yes or no vote, and you say, I'm satisfied with this government. I don't want to go forward. Or I'm not satisfied with this government. I want to go forward. If you go forward, we will elect delegates in the following year. We will hold a convention. And very important to remember, we will return to you for your approval of what the convention does. If you choose to disapprove what a convention does, you vote no at that point, and the matter is dismissed. That's what happened in 1967, and it happened, in my opinion, regrettably, because the 1967 Constitution was demonstrably better than the 1894 Constitution as amended in 1938.
I'm sorry, I just missed the first part of that sentence.
It was a very long sentence. You have to remember, you're dealing with a guy who's used to talking in 50 minutes at a time. If you give it 15 minutes.
If people in New York State vote yes to have a convention, who gets to review?
3 steps. Whether or not you want a convention. Election of delegates. Delegates go to a meeting and revise the Constitution or adopt a new one. And they come back to you and they say, do you like this? Do you like what we did? They can ask you one big question. Here's what we did. Do you like it? Or they can give you 10 questions, as they did in 1938. Here are 10 things we did. Which ones do you like and which ones don't you like? That's at the discretion of the convention. How they ask the question is at the discretion of the convention. So I asked you these questions. How are we going to achieve ethical government, a modern justice system? Rebalancing the relationship between the government and the legislature. Surprisingly, perhaps surprisingly, I think the legislature has been disempowered. I'm not satisfied with the behavior of legislators, but I do think we're drifting from representative government in this country towards executive dominance at every level, and I think it's very dangerous. How are we going to restructure local government so it actually can perform effectively? How can we limit terms for people in high office so they don't get entrenched? Can we have efficient, neutral election administration, not administration in a collusive manner by the political parties that exclude others from the administration of the election, and the Constitution diminishes opportunities for participation? Can we get neutral redistricting? Our recent reform demonstrates that the legislature will not give up control of matters important to it. Their redistricting reform in 2014 was a sham. And if you read it, which I encourage you to do, you will come to that conclusion. Can we strengthen rights? People are concerned about losing rights. We can write in rights and protections that are universal in character and protect other people currently not constitutionally protected. For example, people who are bisexual or gay. Or we could put in protections for women's right to choose, which there's some concern that at the national level that will be rolled back. We can put that into the New York Constitution. So there are rights elevating opportunities. And we want to reform the change process, so the fear about the change process going forward won't be present when we ask the 20-year question next time. The referendum on state government. Process issues. So we're going to talk about these. I'm sure they're going to be raised, so I will very quickly say that a lot of the processes are in the Constitution, so we can't change them unless the legislature agrees to offer amendments on its side of the table. And we have put these amendments before the legislature for the last decade, and they refuse to act. And the reason they refuse to act is because they don't want a convention. And the reason they don't want a convention is they don't want the locus of decision shifted from the legislature and the governor to a body that's elected solely to fix New York government, which is what a convention is. And we'll talk more about that. So there's something I call the catch-22 of this process. The legislature won't change the process. People say, I don't like the process, therefore I'm not going to vote yes. So we have the legislature that doesn't want a convention putting a veto forward that works to keep a convention from happening, if you buy into that argument. So they're vetoing the very process we put in place to hold them accountable. And that's, to me, very problematic. I'll let the other side make their case. Judicial reform. Look at this. We have a 50,000 word document. 16,000 words are about the courts. I have a friend who lives in Buffalo who's a great constitutional historian of New York, contemporary New York, named Peter Daly. I'm on a commission that the chief judge appointed to review this article because she thinks she should like to have a position if this actually happens. Peter said to her in a meeting, I can write this article with 1/3 fewer words and change nothing. He said that's not possible. He actually did it. Now, some of the lawyers on the committee say, you can't do something like that. You change something in there. And maybe he did. But the point is, there's a lot of excess. It's called the unified court system. It's not unified. If there are any attorneys in the room, they'll tell you that. We can do a lot better. And there are reasons this is in the Constitution. The legislature's adopted a lot of amendments, and they've been about things like veterans' preferences, allowing people to take land in the Forever Wild for a sewer district, erecting cell towers in the Adirondack Preserve so people, and it's a good idea, so people don't get trapped in a broken down car in the terrible weather, and they can send them a message. But they didn't change the legislative process, they didn't change the budget process, they didn't change the court process, they didn't change the state and local relationships, all the things that are troubling us about how our government works. They didn't change and address corruption. They didn't do any of those things. This is a provision in the 1967 Constitution that gives a 5-person commission to redistrict the courts. We lost that opportunity because we rejected that Constitution. I'll talk more about that. I have 2 minutes left, less than 2 minutes. Hope against fear. The Forever Wild Clause will be weakened. J.R. May, one of the internationally well-known environmental lawyers, says we are at the cusp of an opportunity to set world examples for environmental progress if we have a constitutional convention. We can advance environmental protections. I urge you to read his writing on the subject. Risk benefits on pensions. The fact of the matter is nobody will touch the pension provision. The reason they won't is, and that's my prediction, the other side makes predictions too without evidence, so I'll make one without evidence. We won't touch the pensions because if you touch them, you lose the Constitution. And if you want to change the process, you don't mobilize the other side to vote. So that's a political argument. The legal argument is the U.S. Constitution protects your pension if you're a public employee. And whether or not there's a provision in the Constitution protecting your pension, the state Constitution is protected by the U.S. Constitution. There's differences on the law. I'm quite convinced that that's an accurate description of the law. The convention is different from a legislature, and we'll come back to that. It's not the same thing. I don't know if there are any Catholics in the room, but I make the analogy to the College of Cardinals. As a Jew, that's an interesting thing for me to do. The reason I make that analogy is because the College of Cardinals comes to do one thing and goes away. It has no institutional interest. And the Constitutional Convention comes to do one thing, affect the people's will the best it can, and then ask the people, is this your will? And if the people say yes, it goes away. One way or another, it doesn't continue. So it's not a legislature where members continue for 20, 30, 40 years. And there are other differences as well. Cost. There's been an absolute misrepresentation of cost based upon error, and I'll talk to you about that. I was fundamentally involved in that. I think this is going to cost about $70 to $75 million. I take that as a percentage of the state budget, and it's rounding error. Now, in my household budget, it's not a rounding error, but in New York State's operations, it is. And I give you some comparisons. The New York Yankee payroll, which is dear to my heart, is 2.5 times the size of the cost of the New York Constitution. The cost is 2.5 the size of the New York Constitution. Still, the public is still by plurality in favor of the idea, but are the pluralities diminishing as uncertainties have arisen because of the attacks on the convention process? This is from the Siena poll. Public knowledge is low, and that has to be changed. That's why I'm here today, even though my wife's in New York City, wondering why I would go on a nice day like this and back early. And I think that one final point, and I'll stop, I know I'm a little past time. One final point is this. One way to energize, and I know a lot of people are energized by the last election, and it's out. I've been to a lot of groups of people who've been talking to me, and journalists and others have been talking to me about this. We have to restore faith in our government, and we need an event to do that. We need a moment where we say, we've looked this over, we've fixed it, and it's going to do better. And this is our moment. We can pass and say, I'm afraid. Bad things might happen, and I'm afraid. I'm not willing to take a risk. And then we will accept the continuation of the government operating as it has for our recent history. And I think that's problematic. And we'll accept the demoralization of people in our society about the nature of democratic politics. And I think that's problematic. So this is our moment to do the right thing. Thank you for your attention.